KM Grid Palettes is a program that places a customizable grid of buttons on the screen of your Mac that can be used to launch Keyboard Maestro macros. My name is Robert Livingston. I'm the author of the program, and I will demonstrate its use in this video. Thanks for taking the time to look at it with me. I would like to show a real-life problem and the assistance that KM Grid Palettes can provide in the solution to that problem. This is a simple example in that Keyboard Maestro will be dealing with only one program, but the modus operandi would be the same for some task that involved many different programs that you are trying to bring into some kind of harmony. This is my problem. I need to get near perfect digital versions of paper documents. OCR versions of long documents are riddled with errors. As a part of dealing with this, I have commonly used two engines to recognize the same document and then compare the two renditions to find errors in one or the other. It may surprise those who are confident of the near future of self-driving cars, but there are a huge number of errors, despite the seeming simplicity of the underlying task. BBEdit is as good a tool as I know to go through comparing two digital versions for discrepancies and selecting the correct one at each point of disagreement. But it's an exhausting task with the necessity of evaluating about 1,000 such discrepancies in the documents I tend to deal with. So it makes sense to spend some time to create a tool to make the task as simple as possible. I can demonstrate the process simply using BBEdit. The initial step is to fill the screen, taking advantage of all the available space and choosing a font that makes distinguishing between commonly confused by man and machine characters easier. So we'll go ahead and choose such a font and make it of a size that it fits on the screen. And then we can go here to soft wrap the text so all the text is visible. And then we're now ready to march through the document, finding errors. Along the right-hand side, there's a graphic that gives you some idea of the huge number of errors that we're going to be dealing with. BBEdit divides the document into somewhat bite-sized chunks, these green areas, and you can declare one or the other chunk correct as you move through the document. So here it identifies the first discrepancy. We can see that this is correct and that's incorrect. In BBEdit, to deal with that, you apply the correct side to the incorrect side. And then you march on to the next point of disagreement. Here, this is incorrect, so we want to apply the correct side to this incorrect side. And then you'll run into this situation where this single chunk has many points of error or discrepancy in it, and you can go here and select the individual error and work your way through the document in this fashion. So the error here is that there's no space on this side, so we apply the correct side to the incorrect side, move on to the next. Here is the single quote which should be in place. We apply that. Moving on, this is a 1 and a 1, that's an L and an L. This is correct. Apply the cross and march on down through the document in this fashion. When you have to do some actual correction manually, like this, you end up having to type in the correction because neither side is correct. So we'll go and get rid of those spaces on this side. And now, to reset the whole process, we have to go back to the start, and we hit this reset button. And now that brings us to the start again, and we can start marching through the document looking for problems. Occasionally you'll run into a problem that you really can't resolve at the time because you actually don't know what the correct answer is. And so it's important to have a skip function So if I don't want to deal with this now, I can hit a simple next button and wander on to the next problem at hand. After working with this, you can see that there really are about 9 or 10 functions that you have to deal with. The first was setting up the initial window and choosing the font, then soft wrapping the text, and then setting up which was the good side and which was the bad side. Sometimes we had to identify individually, and sometimes we had to start over, and occasionally we wanted to skip to the next discrepancy. I have shown you the general process using the native interface of BBEdit. Now you can watch the same tasks being done directed by a custom Keyboard Maestro palette. We'll quit that and start over again. We now have a custom palette. We have to choose the space and we have to make the window the right size. So we'll click on this button here, and that automatically makes the window the correct size and lets me choose the appropriate font. We can place this grid at the bottom of our work area, bottom of the screen, and now do the tasks using this palette. So the next task we have at hand is to soft wrap the text. So I'll hit this wrap button, and that's been done. And now the next part is simply to go through and find the discrepancies. Here is the first error. This side is correct. But now, rather than having to hit these small touch targets or click targets and trying to figure out that this means that this side is correct and you're moving it onto this side, now I have a conceptually simpler system where these two buttons refer to the right document and these two buttons refer to the left document. And if something is bad on this side, I can just hit this button here, and that's corrected. Here, something's bad on this side. Again, I can hit this. If I wanted to, I could hit the other side, that the other side was correct. But wherever your brain is functioning or wherever your eyes are looking at the current time is the easiest way to deal with this. So I can see that's incorrect. I hit the incorrect button. It's corrected. Now I've moved on to one of these chunks where there are many errors inside, and I have to individualize them. So I can hit the individualize button, so I'm only dealing with one. I see that's correct. I hit the correct button. I see that's correct. I hit the correct button. I see that this is incorrect. I hit the incorrect button. I see that that's incorrect. Hit the incorrect button, and work our way through it. That's correct. This is incorrect. That's correct. And this is how you can work through the document. Here I have to deal with it manually. So I'll get rid of these two spaces here. And now I have to reset the program to make it work. So I'll hit the baby button. And now we're restarted. We've reset it. And we can move to the next discrepancy and work our way through fixing the various errors. Now let's take a look at how I created this palette. I went ahead when I was working on this and decided, well, there are about 10 things that we need to get done, and I'll keep these up here so we can see what we need to design in our palette. We can get rid of this for the moment. And we can make a new palette so you can see the process from the start. So we'll create a new palette and we'll call it BBEdit Compare. Create a palette, and initially you'll see the default raw palette, which will contain 8 rows and 8 columns. and we want to make this of a size that makes sense for our purposes. So we're going to go here and go to the Grid Construct window, which lets us construct a custom palette. The first thing, we only need one row, although we need all the 10 columns. So we'll reduce that to a single row. And I do not need shortcuts on these buttons, so we'll assign no shortcuts. By default, it assigns these shortcuts, A, B, C, D. You can see here, and those are keyboard shortcuts for the various buttons, but we don't need them, so we'll say assign no shortcuts to everything. And we can give the window a more meaningful title, so give that a title. It'll appear as it does here. And then we can deal with the individual buttons and what they mean. So we'll go to that first button and say that we need to give it the tip for what that button is. And we have the various tips here. So on that first one, we'll say we'll accept that. Go to the next button. And if we perceive that to be a complicated concept, we can write a fuller description. And now I've decided for this third button, we'll just make it invisible and use that as a separator. So that button won't be visible. We'll go on to this button, which was the left bad button. So now I have provided a tip for each button, and we're done with this construction. At this point, you have created a functioning but drab set of palette buttons that will work but are confusing to use. You can see the tips if you move the cursor over the button, but we want something more immediately recognizable. The second step is to assign graphics that you have designed to each of your buttons. You can use whatever program you want to create 64-pixel buttons. The only rule is that the first two characters of the graphics match the name of the button to which it's going to be attached. We'll go to the Button Pictures menu to finalize this process. Now that you've added all these pictures, we're done with this phase, and we can see what the palette looks like in its final form. Finally, you have to create a Keyboard Maestro macro to actually perform the action that has been requested. This is all explained in the manual, but the basic rule is that you need a macro with the same name as the palette. KM Grid palettes will fire up this macro and pass the ID of the button that was clicked so that Keyboard Maestro can decide what to do. You're not restricted to a single palette. You can have many, many palettes, each linked to their own individual Keyboard Maestro macro. Now you can see when the cursor is overlying a button that this is the P7 palette, and that's the 00 button. So this clarifies what macro and what button you're trying to communicate to Keyboard Maestro. If you look at the Keyboard Maestro script itself, they generally will start with a trigger value that conveys which button was actually clicked on, and the palette itself, or excuse me, the macro itself is named after the palette to which it is connected. I commonly will use a switch action at this point, which will take the which button information and decide what actions are actually going to be executed when that button is clicked, or when this button is clicked, or when this button is clicked, etc. Some of the advantages and disadvantages of KM Grid palettes can be seen in this example I've just given. It takes a certain amount of time to set up, more than would be required for some of the built-in palettes of Keyboard Maestro. On the other hand, the design of the 2D grid can mirror the task at hand. In this example, these left-handed buttons corresponded to dealing with the left-handed document, and these more right-sided buttons dealt with the right-sided document. You have the ability to create a richer explanation of the tasks that can be provided in the tips and in the info area to make it easier to come back to the task after a few weeks have passed. We wrote some information more extensively about this particular button, which we can see by option clicking on it. So we have that more extensive text. And the palette itself can be conveniently placed relative to the work being done on the screen, more intimately than the graphics on an Elgato Stream Deck. And in our case, clicking with a mouse is probably the easiest way to invoke the subtasks of the job at hand. Everything that I need is right in front of me. KM Grid Palettes is a free program, and I hope you'll give it a try. I'm delighted to hear about your experiences, be they good or bad, and any suggestions for improvements. There's a website that allows you to download the program and the accompanying manual that explains its function and use more completely.